I think I heard it this afternoon. I always knew I'd hear it completely someday. I always had an inclination, a suspicion, but I was wrought with the skepticism of modern life, a skepticism that rewards those who follow it for decades. Yeah, I think I heard it. I can't forget it. I know what it was, and I fear next time it won't subside the way it did this afternoon. I parked on the side of the street because my wife's van was in the driveway. Like always, I slammed my car door loud enough to tease the kids. Daddy's home. I crossed the sidewalk and stopped at our mailbox, which was staked along the white picket fence perimetering the front lawn, mowed just the other day, might I add, and examined the mess of bills and adverts that had been slipped into the box. I flipped through the envelopes, pushing open the white picket gate with my hip and inching onto the pathway into the front yard. But I caught a whiff of whatever my wife was cooking inside and decided that whatever we had gotten in the mail could wait. It smelled greasy, crispening in the August air. After lifting my face from the mail to smell that aroma that welcomed me home, I caught a glance at the red plastic bucket and the 2 yellow plastic shovels in the driveway beside the van. I opened up the front door and walked into the foyer, almost tripping over a stuffed armadillo, but the smell of dinner and the bang of my children eroded any scolding that I could have done. My boys bounced over to see me before I could even close the door behind me. They latched onto me in a hug. "Hey guys," I chuckled. My wife appeared across the hall in the entrance to the kitchen, wearing a lime green t-shirt and a baby blue cooking apron over it. Her most prominent features being her hands on her hips, something she'd become a master of over the years since the birth of our children. She stood so, in a steadfast way like a superhero. "Hi, honey," I greeted her, my dying chuckle ending in the normal tone for her. She just gave me a smile and looked down at our boys, who were still clinging to me. "How was the beach, guys?" I looked down at the 2 of them. "Good," Thomas bounced. "Mom wanted us to build a sandcastle, but we dug a hole instead," William confessed proudly. I gave my wife, Lexi, a half-cocked smile. Our understanding of their cute but comic disobedience stretched across the hall. "It was the biggest hole in the world," Thomas said, bouncing up again. "Bigger than the Grand Canyon?" I asked. There was no pause or hesitation in my boys. They jumped together, going, "Yes, yes!" "Now, just how much of the beach did you guys bring home?" I asked, looking around the foyer until my wife spoke from down the hall. "I hosed them down when we got home." I looked down at our boys. They smiled up at me, apparently unaware of just how much they still smelled like sunscreen. "Come on, kids, let your dad come in," Lexi said, waving them away. They obeyed, the backs of their head bouncing with hair as they ran to her. I wiped my shoes on the welcome mat and walked into the hall, went upstairs into my wife and I's bedroom, and put down the mail on our bureau, undid my tie, and left it on the bed. I came back downstairs to meet my wife in the kitchen. I usually put away my ties, but the smell of dinner was just too enticing. "How was the office?" Lexi asked after I kissed her on the cheek. "How's the turkey coming? God, I could smell it almost as much as all that beach you 2 dragged home," I gruffed, ruffling each of the kids' heads. They were already sitting at the kitchen table. Lexi pirouetted and caught herself against the counter, propping her hand against it behind her back as she blew her hair out of her face. "It's so hot in here with the oven. Can we turn on the AC?" she asked. I couldn't say no to her, and it was humid after all. "Of course. Kids, go shut the windows and turn on the AC." They bounced out of their chairs and hurried off, the squeak of the windows being shut erupting throughout the house as they raced each other. I noticed that there were 2 pots bubbling on the stove, broccoli and potatoes. "I'm just in time to mash the potatoes," I said, in my way of offering to help, relieving my wife a little bit, even though she wouldn't show it. I strained the potatoes, put them back into the pot, and started mashing them after sprinkling garlic powder and Parmesan cheese over them. In the nick of time, we realized she forgot the gravy, and as the steam from the potatoes settled in my face, I hurried downstairs into the basement to retrieve a can of mushroom gravy. "Go on, sit down," my wife swatted me away from the stove. I obeyed her and plopped down in my designated chair and scooted it in. "Do you want a drink, honey?" she asked, as she swarmed across the kitchen table to set out milk for the kids. "No, I'm good," I shook my head, about to pick up my knife and fork before the turkey was even on the table. Adjusting in my chair, I caught a glimpse of each of my son's smiles. Their passing smiles stuck out in my memory because it was the last normal thing I saw before it happened. How clumsily I must have smirked back. I wondered if I turned my head too suddenly. I wondered if this all came about because I twisted my head incorrectly. And that's what caused it. That's what pulled the muscle of space and time that evening. This is wishful thinking, of course. I saw my wife bending down, 2 puffy oven mitts on her hands, as she pulled out the big tin-foil tray with the bronze-crusted turkey in it. It happened just as she went to spin around to face the table. A loud gong sounded like a giant bell tower, letting out one large chime, erupted in my ears. Turning, turkey in hand, my wife was turning slower than usual, while the gong echoed lower and lower in my head. My sons were smiling up at her, fidgeting in their seats, but slowly fidgeting. Just as my family almost returned to normal speed, an identical gong erupted in my head, and they all slowed down again, this time while Lexi was lowering down the turkey to the table. I was too confused to say anything about it. Evidently, it didn't affect them, or they weren't aware of it, because my son still smiled, and my wife had a look that said all was well in the universe. She swept her cooking apron out of the way when she went to sit down at the sound of the 3rd giant chime. It gave me a massive headache, but I couldn't cringe. I wondered fleetingly if this was a stroke or something, but part of me knew what it was. I can't imagine what expression I had in the echoes of that phantom gong, that phantom grandfather clock warning. Time must have moved normally for my family, but for the duration of that echoing, my face must have contorted into a display of absolute defeat. There was something final in that gong, the chime, the ringing, whatever it was. It reverberated in my entire body, leaving an ache all over my heart, squeezing my heart to the point of pumping fear into my eyes. But time repaired itself as the echo fizzled down into a low dinging, and whatever tears had appeared in my eye ducts had receded. Time restored itself, and instead of terror, my face must have just displayed a simple seriousness, an eagerness to eat. My wife had started cutting the turkey when I came to. My sons nor my wife had noticed what came over me, how fast everything seemed to move when time was normal again, when the kitchen unwrapped itself with a snap as if air bubbles of reality were popping, and this reality was its puddle. We ate dinner. I asked furthermore about their day at the beach, jokingly asking if they saw any sharks, and pretending like I hadn't just experienced an existential aneurysm. I pretended like I had an appetite, standing up to pick through the dark meat while each of our boys got each of the turkey legs, although the legs were a little too big for them. What lingering worry I had that the sound would return was assuaged then, and when I sat back down with my second helping of meat, I began telling myself that it was just some sort of bizarre headache. While helping my wife do the dishes, scrubbing a plate, and getting lost in the ballad of the sponge, I wondered if I had suffered some strange bout of heat stroke. It was a hot day after all, and hot inside the kitchen because of the oven. We sat down in the living room where one of the air conditioners was humming like a guard who'd started humming while standing watch. It was 7, and time for Wheel of Fortune. Lexi had scooped the boys bowls of pistachio ice cream. Maybe a mature flavor for their age, but they liked it, and liked it especially because of the chocolate chips she sprinkled on it. I had plain old vanilla, though. My wife is a genius, but she kept her mouth shut to let the boys have time enough to solve the puzzles. I could see the smart-ass look in her eyes as she cleaned her spoon of ice cream, as if keeping it there in her mouth would keep her from blurting out the answer. And when the Wheel of Fortune ended, the long progress of convincing the boys to go to bed began, chasing them around to try to get them to brush their teeth. The gong, as if from out of a cut in the cosmos, that chime came again, as if accidentally finding its way into my mind. I froze in the upstairs hallway as Thomas ran away laughing, slower and slower, the bounce of his steps becoming emphasized, the slower that time became and the echoes of that phantom chime. William scooted by me, his distorted laughter like a kite in his wake. Lexi scooted by me next, even slower. Her giggles slowed as it became absorbed by the phantom chimes, by the slow, drawn-out chimes. I stayed there in the hallway, my fingers twitching at my hip at a normal speed, but I watched my family recede slower and slower down the hall that now seemed to elongate. The hallway was stretching. The thunderous chimes were rolling out of my house. All the AC humming and laughing became completely absorbed in the echo of the phantom chime. My spine was a foreboding grandfather clock that crashed its bells against my heart. My wife and children disappeared into our bedroom, and I stayed standing in the hallway, watching the hallway stretch and stretch, but my height remained the same. But when the echoes were whining out and losing their reach, the hallway began to warp back to normalcy. But now this may have been my heartbeat trying to snap me out of whatever this was, just as the hallway was snapping back to me. There was a ticking, an old-fashioned ticking, a steady swinging pendulum like an old grandfather clock, in the absence of a cosmic chime, of the phantom chime, the gong, whatever it was. The ticking became domineering. The ticking was prominent. The ticking refused to let me move. I had to stay there and listen to that maddening ticking. Surely, even though time was restored, my face was stuck in an expression of astonishment, and I dreaded that my family would run out of the bedroom and see me frozen in the hallway, not blinking, not moving, just standing there with a 1,000-yard stare. That's what I had. It must have made my eyes crystallize with the dryness that comes from not blinking, my almost teary eyes begging for it to stop. I blinked. Thomas and William came rushing out with Lexi on their tail, smiling and leaning down to catch them. But like always, she let them get away and continued to chase and tire them out. My spirit stuttered. I limped around to join the chase. I jogged, even though I felt woozy. Eventually, the boys were in their bed. I stood in the doorway, watching Lexi tuck them in, and their nightlight cast shadows on the wall. They definitely were tired, all right. They clutched the hems of their sheets and looked up at her like baby birds in their nest. "Good night, boys," I spoke. "I love you." "Love you too, Daddy," Thomas said. William must have been too tired to say it back. His eyelids were fluttering. Lexi walked to me, and we walked back downstairs to watch TV. She fell asleep before me, which it's usually me first, but that night I couldn't sleep. I laid on my back, arms over my chest, looking up at the ceiling and waiting to hear the chime again, to hear the ticking inside me spring up again. How could I fall asleep beside her? I was too guilty. I knew why this was happening. Couldn't even bring myself to look her in the face in the dark, my consciousness clinging on to the constant hum of the air conditioner. I knew why this was happening. Yes, I knew why, but I'm too good of a man to agree to it. I am this way for my wife and kids because I love them. I never thought I'd fall in love. I never thought I'd have made 2 wonderful sons, but I love them just the same. I swear I wouldn't change a thing about my life, but I know why this is happening. It's a warning. The plain old job I wasn't meant for. It's a good paying job, yes. Benefits included, yes. It pays the bills and gives my family a good life, but it's not what I was meant to do with my life. It's not what outer space had in mind for me. The ticking. There it is again. I wonder if something is angry with me, disappointed in me. I let something greater than myself down. I'm not letting my family down. No. That's why I have to work tomorrow. But I know why I'll be haunted by this incessant ticking at the office. As I lay here, I feel the nebulous gases of another dimension slowly reaching in to grab me before I could complete my destiny. What my original destiny was, I don't know. I made my own destiny, and yes, it feeds my family, but why is this thing, this ticking, this chime angry with me? A disappointed original destiny. Is that what's pushing me or warning me? It feels like something is coming for me, or my current modern-day destiny is solidifying, and I'm out of time to change it now. I gulped. The people I love, the woman beside me that I love, the children that are part of me, are strangers to this original destiny. To this destiny I was forced not to choose. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I shuffled through the stacks of applications on my desk. Another day, another pile of desperate people hoping to secure some fragment of security in an uncertain world. I'd been working at Everlast Life Insurance for over a decade, and the faces all kind of blurred together after a while. Young families, middle-aged divorcees, elderly folks grasping at one last chance to leave something behind. I'd seen it all. Or so I thought. It was late on a Friday afternoon when his file crossed my desk. Most of my co-workers had already left for the weekend, their vacant cubicles forming a maze of shadows in the dimming office. I should have been out the door myself, but something made me pause as I reached for my coat. Maybe it was the worn edges of the manila folder, or the faded photograph paperclipped to the front. Whatever it was, I found myself sinking back into my chair, flipping open the files of Mr. Ezekiel Thorne. The photo showed a withered old man, his skin like crumpled parchment stretched over sharp bones. But it was his eyes that gave me pause. Pale blue and piercing, they seemed to stare right through the camera and into my soul. I shivered involuntarily and turned to the application itself. Ezekiel Thorne, age 92, no living relatives, former occupation, mortician, current address, 13 Ravens Lane. As I scanned his medical history, my eyebrows steadily crept higher. This man should have been dead 10 times over. Heart attacks, cancer, strokes, he'd survived it all. Now here he was, the ripe old age of 92, applying for a substantial life insurance policy. I'll admit, a small part of me was impressed. The old codger had beaten the odds time and time again, but the larger part, the part that had kept me employed at Everlast for all these years, saw only dollar signs and risk. There was no way the company would approve this, The potential payout far outweighed any premium that we could charge. So with a sigh, I reached for the large red denied stamp. It's just business after all. It wasn't personal. As the stamp came down with a dull thud, a chill ran down my spine. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw those pale blue eyes staring at me from the shadow of my cubicle. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office and the ever-present hum of the fluorescent lights. Get it together, I told myself. You're working too late. It's time to go home. I hurriedly shoved Mr. Thorne's file into the outgoing mail and grabbed my coat. As I rushed out the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The weight of that gaze seemed to follow me all the way to my car. That night I dreamed of pale blue eyes and the smell of formaldehyde. The next week passed in a blur of routine. I processed applications, attended meetings, did my best to forget about Ezekiel Thorne. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the lingering unease that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. It was exactly 1 week later when I heard the news. I was in the break room, pouring my third cup of coffee, when I overheard 2 coworkers gossiping by the vending machine. "Did you hear about that old man who died last night? The one who lived in that creepy house on Ravens Lane?" I froze, my mug halfway to my lips. "Oh yeah, what was his name? Thornton or Thorne?" "Ezekiel Thorne," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My coworkers turned to look at me, startled. "Yeah, that's it. Did you know him?" I couldn't answer. The room was spinning, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. I mumbled some excuse and stumbled back to my cubicle, collapsing into my chair. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Old people die all the time. It had nothing to do with me or the denied application. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't help but remember those piercing blue eyes. And I could have sworn I caught a whiff of formaldehyde drifting through the recycled office air. That night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Thorne's wrinkled face, his eyes accusing and full of malice. When I finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, my dreams were haunted by the sound of a pen scratching endlessly across paper, filling out an application that would never be approved. I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I realized with growing horror that the scratching sound hadn't stopped. It was coming from outside my bedroom door. Trembling, I reached for the bedside lamp. As the light flooded the room, the scratching abruptly ceased. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement from the hallway beyond. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, something slid under my door. A manila folder, its edges worn and familiar. With shaking hands, I picked it up, opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in spidery handwriting, were the words, "Life insurance application." The rest of the page was blank, save for 2 words stamped at the bottom. Claim denied. I let out a strangled cry and threw the folder across the room. This couldn't be happening. This was a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. When I opened them again, the folder was gone, but the faint smell of formaldehyde lingered in the air, and I knew with sickening certainty that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the office, couldn't bear to look at another insurance application. Spent the day huddled in my apartment, jumping at every creak and shadow. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been my imagination. Almost. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn to my computer, With trembling fingers, I typed Ezekiel Thorne into the search bar. What I found chilled me to the bone. The first result was an obituary dated 2 days ago, but it wasn't the date that caught my attention. It was the photo. The man in the photo was undoubtedly Ezekiel Thorne, but he looked wrong. His skin was waxy, his posture too stiff, and his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had haunted my dreams, were open, staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. That couldn't be right. No funeral home would publish a photo like that. Would they? A soft thud from the hallway made me jump. I froze, listening intently. Another thud, closer this time. Then another. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps, approaching my door. I held my breath, praying it was just a neighbor. The footsteps stopped right outside my apartment. For a long time, there was only silence. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through my entire body. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Maybe if I played perfectly still, whoever or whatever was out there would just go away. Another knock, louder this time. Then a voice, dry and raspy, like dead leaves, skittering across the pavement.
I know you're there, Mr. Insurance Man. We have unfinished business.
I bit back a scream. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening.
You denied my claim,
the voice continued, seeping under my door like a noxious gas.
but I'm not finished yet. Not by a long shot.
The doorknob began to turn, metal scraping against metal. I watched in terror as it slowly rotated, defying the deadbolt that I knew was securely in place. Just as the door began to creak open, I snapped out of my paralysis. I ran to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I could hear shuffling footsteps in the living room, getting closer.
You can't hide from death forever,
the voice called out, now just outside the bedroom door.
Sooner or later, someone's policy comes due.
I blinked, backing away from the door, looking wildly around for an escape route. The window caught my eye. I was only on the 3rd floor. I could make that jump. I had to. The bedroom doorknob began to turn. I didn't hesitate. I flung open the window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge. The cool night air hit me like a slap, clearing some of the panic from my mind. What was I doing? This was insane. I was 3 stories up, clinging to the side of a building, because I thought a dead man was trying to get into my apartment. I slowly turned back towards the window, ready to climb back inside and face whatever madness awaited me. But as I peered through the glass, my blood ran cold. Ezekiel Thorne stood in my bedroom, his pale blue eyes locked onto mine. His skin was gray and mottled, his suit the same one he'd been buried in. As I watched in horror, he raised one withered hand and beckoned to me. I lost my balance, my foot slipping off the ledge. For one heart-stopping moment, I teetered on the edge of oblivion. Then I was falling, the ground rushing up to meet me. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. Multiple fractures. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. As I lay there trying to piece together what had happened, a nurse came in with a small package. "This was left for you at the front desk," she said, placing it on my bedside table. With a sense of dread, I opened the package. Inside was a life insurance policy from Everlast. My own company had apparently taken out a policy on me without my knowledge. There at the bottom of the page was a familiar red stamp, claim denied. I started to laugh, the sound bordering on hysterics. The nurse looked at me with concern, but I couldn't stop, because there in the corner of the room I could see a pair of pale blue eyes watching me from the shadow. This was far from over. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms and physical therapy. I told myself that what I'd experienced was just a vivid hallucination brought on by the stress and lack of sleep. The fall from my window, a moment of sleepwalking, nothing more. I almost believed it. But every night, as the hospital grew quiet and the shadows lengthened, I could feel those eyes on me. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a withered figure at the end of the hallway, or hear the shuffle of feet outside my door. The night staff whispered about the smell of formaldehyde that seemed to linger in my room, no matter how much they cleaned it. I was released from the hospital on a gray, drizzly Tuesday. As the taxi pulled up at my apartment, I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't face those eyes, the room where I'd seen him. "Keep driving," I told the cabbie, giving him the address of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I finally allowed myself to think about what had happened. If Ezekiel Thorne was really dead, and I'd seen his obituary, hadn't I, then how could he be haunting me? And why? 'Cause I'd denied his life insurance application? It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. A soft knock at the door made me jump. I held my breath, waiting. It came again, more insistent this time.
"Mr. Life Insurance Man,"
that dry, raspy voice called out again.
"You can't run forever. Your policy is coming due."
I bolted upright, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not again. The doorknob began to turn. I scrambled out of bed, looking frantically for an escape route. The bathroom window was small, but I was desperate enough to try squeezing through it. As I rushed towards the bathroom, the motel room door creaked open behind me. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mixture of formaldehyde and decay. I slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the simple task. The shuffling footsteps grew closer.
Now,
Ezekiel's voice rasped just outside the bathroom door.
"Is that any way to treat a client? We have a policy to discuss."
I turned on the faucet full blast, hoping to drown out his words. Somehow his voice cut through the rush of water, clear as a bell, though.
"You denied me a life, Mr. Insurance Man, but death is a much more accommodating underwriter."
The doorknob rattled. I backed away, pressing myself against the small window. It was stuck, decades of paint sealing it shut. I clawed at it, desperate, fingernails breaking as I tried to force it open. A bony hand burst through the door, splintering wood as if it were paper. I screamed, a sound of pure terror that I barely recognized as my own. My hands groped around, finding the lock and turning it with a decisive click. The door swung open. I finally managed to break the seal on the window. I didn't even bother to clear away the broken glass before I started to squeeze through the tiny opening. The shards slashed at my skin, but I barely felt the pain. All I could focus on was my escape. I tumbled out onto the wet pavement of the motel's back alley, the rain soaking me instantly. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I ran and ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing in a park several miles away. As I sat there gasping for breath, shivering in the cold rain. I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't go on. I couldn't keep running forever. There had to be a way to end this, to appease the spirit of Ezekiel Thorne. With a sudden clarity, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I dragged myself into Everlast Insurance office. My colleagues stared as I limped past, clothes torn and stained, face gaunt with exhaustion and fear. I ignored them all, making my way straight to the records room. It took me hours of searching, but I finally found what I was looking for. Ezekiel Thorne's original application. With shaking hands, I pulled out a pen and changed the denied stamp to approved. I filled out the necessary paperwork, backdating it to before his death. As I signed the final form, I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly, I turned around. Ezekiel Thorne stood there, a grotesque smile stretching his decaying face.
"Well done, Mr. Insurance Man, but I'm afraid it's too late for that."
I blinked, and suddenly I was back in my apartment, sitting at my desk. The insurance papers were gone. In their place was a single document. My own death certificate, dated today.
"You see, your policies come due the moment you denied mine. Everything since then, that was just a grace period."
I felt a bony hand on my shoulder, and the world began to fade away. I woke up screaming, tangled in sheets, soaked in sweat. My heart was racing, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. As reality slowly seeped back in, I realized I was in my own bed, in my own apartment. It had all been a nightmare, a vivid, terrifying dream, but a nightmare nonetheless. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by embarrassment. How could I have let a simple insurance application affect me so deeply? I glanced at the clock. It was 3:07 in the morning. With a sigh, I got up to get a glass of water, hoping it would calm my nerves. The hallway was empty, shadows stretching in the dim light. I let out a shaky laugh. Get a grip, I told myself. It was just a dream. I turned back towards the kitchen, found myself face to face with Ezekiel Thorne. His pale blue eyes bored into mine, his withered face inches from my own. The smell of formaldehyde was overwhelming.
"Sweet dreams, Mr. Insurance Man," he rasped.
Then with a bony finger he reached out and tapped me on the forehead. I jolted awake, gasping for air. My bedroom was dark and quiet. No sign of any undead visitors. Just another nightmare, but as I reached up to wipe the sweat from my brow, my blood ran cold. There in the center of my forehead, I felt a small cold spot, exactly where Ezekiel's finger had touched me in my dream. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the bathroom, flipping on the lights. In the mirror, I saw a small, perfectly round bruise forming on my forehead. As I stared at it in horror, I could have sworn I saw pale eyes reflecting in the mirror behind me. I whirled around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the eyes were gone, but the bruise remained, a tangible reminder that the lines between nightmare and reality had blurred. From that night on, sleep became the enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, Ezekiel was waiting. Sometimes he chased me through the endless twisting corridors. Other times he simply stood and watched, those pale blue eyes never blinking. Always I woke up to new bruises, scratches, or other inexplicable marks. During the day I was a wreck. I couldn't focus on work. I jumped at every sound and seeing Ezekiel's face in every shadow. My colleagues whispered behind my back, their concerned looks following me as I stumbled through the office like a ghost. I knew I was losing grips with reality, but what could I do? Who would believe me if I told them I was being haunted by the ghost of a man whose life insurance policy I denied? As weeks passed, I grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, the boundaries between waking and sleeping, reality and nightmares becoming increasingly blurred. I would find myself in strange places with no memories of how I'd got there, standing on the roof of my apartment building or in the middle of a graveyard across town. As always, I felt those blue eyes watching me. I knew I couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. In desperation, I decided to confront the source of my torment. I would go to Ezekiel Thorne's grave and what? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? I didn't know, but I had to do something. The cemetery was eerily quiet as I made my way through the rows of headstones. The sun was setting, casting long shadows along the ground. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. Finally, I found it. A simple granite headstone with the name Ezekiel Thorne carved into it. Below that was the date of his birth and his death, and at the bottom there was a single line. His claim was denied, but his spirit endures. I stood there, staring at those words as darkness fell around me. What was I doing here? What did I hope to accomplish? "I'm sorry," I whispered, feeling foolish but desperate. "I'm sorry I denied your application. I was just doing my job. Please, just leave me alone." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of nearby trees. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper on the breeze.
"Too late, Mr. Insurance Man. Far too late."
I turned to leave, my heart heavy with the realization that this had all been for nothing. But as I took a step away from the grave, the ground beneath my feet suddenly gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils as I landed hard on something solid. As I lay there, winded and disoriented, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The scrape of wood on wood, like a coffin lid being slowly opened. A bony hand emerged from the darkness, gripping my ankle. I was dragged deeper into the earth. The last thing I saw, a pair of pale blue eyes, gleaming with triumph.
"Welcome,"
Ezekiel's raspy voice echoed around me.
"to your eternal policy, Mr. Insurance Man. I'm afraid the premiums are quite steep, but don't worry. We have all eternity to settle accounts."
The darkness closed in, and I knew that my claim on life had finally been denied. I jolted awake, my heart pounding so hard that I thought it might burst from my chest. The familiar surroundings of my bedroom slowly came into focus. Bathed in the soft glow of early morning light, I was drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs like a burial shroud. For a moment, relief washed over me. It had all been a dream, a horrifically vivid nightmare, but a dream nonetheless. I let out an exhausted laugh, running my hands through my hair. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady. The world seemed to tilt and swim around me as I made my way to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of my nightmare. But when I looked into the mirror, my blood ran cold. There, reflected in the glass behind me, were a pair of pale blue eyes. I whirled around, my heart in my throat, but the bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, they were gone again. I called in sick that day, unable to face the thought of dealing with more insurance claims. Instead, I spent hours researching hauntings, exorcisms, anything that might help me understand what was happening. But the more I read, the more helpless I felt. How could I fight something that shouldn't even exist? As night fell, I found myself dreading sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Ezekiel's withered face, those pale blue eyes boring into my soul. I tried everything to stay awake. Coffee, energy drinks, even slapping myself across the face. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into an uneasy slumber. The dream started as it always did. I was back at Everlast Insurance, Ezekiel's file open on my desk. This time, as I reached for the denied stamp, I hesitated. What if I approved it? Would that end the nightmares? With a trembling hand, I picked up the approved stamp instead. As it came down on the paper, I felt a rush of relief. Maybe now it would be over. But as I looked up, Ezekiel was there, his decaying face inches from mine.
"Too late, Mr. Insurance Man," he rasped. "Your policy has already been cashed in."
I woke up, screaming, thrashing against the sheets. As I fought to catch my breath, I realized something was different. The room smelled wrong, like formaldehyde and decay. I slowly turned my head towards the bedroom door. It was open. Standing in the doorway was a figure that I had hoped never to see in the waking world. Ezekiel Thorne shuffled into the room, his movements stiff and unnatural. In the dim light, I could see the waxy sheen of his skin, the sunken hollow of his cheeks, but it was the eyes that had me paralyzed. Those pale blue orbs, now cloudy with death, but still piercing in their intensity.
"Did you really think it would be that easy?"
he wheezed, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement.
"That you could simply stamp approved and wash your hands of me?"
I tried to speak, to plead, to reason with him, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't respond, pinned to the bed by an unseen force. Ezekiel reached the side of the bed, looming over me.
"You denied me in life, Mr. Insurance Man, but death is far more lenient. And now it's time to collect on your policy."
He reached out a bony hand, his fingers pointing directly at my forehead. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was to come. But the touch never came. Instead, I heard a sound that did not belong. The shrill ring of a telephone. My eyes snapped open. I was alone in my bedroom, sunlight streaming through the windows. The phone on my nightstand continued to ring insistently. With a shaking hand, I picked it up. "Hello?" "Mr. Johnson," it was my boss's voice. "Where are you? You were supposed to be here an hour ago for the meeting with the new client." I glanced at the clock and cursed. I had overslept. "I'm sorry. I'll be right there," I stammered, already scrambling out of bed. As I rushed to get ready, my mind was reeling. Had it all been a dream? But the bruise on my forehead was still there, faded but visible. I made it to the office in record time, sliding into the conference room just as the meeting was starting. As I took my seat, trying to catch my breath, I froze. Sitting across the table, his pale blue eyes locked on mine, was Ezekiel Thorne. He looked different in the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. Less corpse-like, more human, but there was no mistaking those eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I'd like you to meet our new client, Mr. Thorne. He's interested in a rather unique life insurance policy." Ezekiel's lips curled into a small smile.
"It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Insurance Man," he said,
his voice dry but devoid of the otherworldly rasp I had come to associate with him.
"I have a feeling we're going to be working very closely together."
As he reached across the table to shake my hand, I saw the glint of triumph in those pale blue eyes. I knew with sickening certainty that this was only the beginning. The meeting passed in a blur. I nodded and smiled automatically, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How could Ezekiel be here, alive and well, when I'd seen his obituary, when he had haunted my dreams and invaded my waking hours as a decaying corpse? As the other attendees filed out of the room, Ezekiel lingered. He approached me slowly, his movements fluid and natural, nothing like the stiff, shuffling gait of the creature that had haunted me.
"Quite a shock, isn't it, Mr. Johnson?" he said,
softly, his pale blue eyes never leaving mine.
"To see a dead man among the living."
I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't understand. You were... I saw you." Ezekiel's smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a shade too white, too perfect.
"Death is not always as final as people believe, especially for those of us who have certain connections."
He leaned in closer, and I caught a whiff of that familiar formaldehyde scent.
"You denied my claim once, Mr. Insurance Man, but now I'm offering you a policy of your own, one that will guarantee your safety and sanity."
What do you want?" I whispered, unable to look away from those hypnotic blue eyes.
"It's simple, really. You'll be my personal insurance agent from now on. Every policy I bring you, you'll approve, no questions asked. In return, I'll ensure that your nights are peaceful, and your days, well, let's just say you won't have to worry about any unexpected visits."
I knew I should refuse. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, but the memories of those endless nightmares, the constant fear and paranoia, it was all too fresh.
"Do we have a deal, Mr. Insurance Man?"
Ezekiel extended his hand, his pale blue eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. With a sense of finality, I reached out and shook his hand. His skin was cold and dry, like old parchment.
"Excellent," Ezekiel said,
his smile growing impossibly wide.
"I look forward to a long and profitable relationship."
As he turned to leave, he paused at the door.
"Oh, and Mr. Johnson, sweet dreams."
That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without nightmares. But as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just signed away something far more valuable than any insurance policy. And in the shadows of my room, I could have sworn I saw a pair of pale blue eyes watching, waiting, as I descended into dreamless sleep. The weeks that followed were a blur of surreal normalcy. By day, I went through the motions at work, approving every policy that crossed my desk with Ezekiel's name attached. They were always for astronomical sums, always for clients with medical histories that should have disqualified them immediately. But I stamped each one approved without hesitation, the memory of those nightmarish weeks still fresh in my mind. By night, I slept peacefully, undisturbed by visions of decay and whispers of eternity. But the price of this tranquility weighed heavily on my conscience. As the months wore on, I began to notice changes in myself. My reflection in the mirror looked older, somehow, gaunt. There were more streaks of gray in my hair that hadn't been there before. It was as if Ezekiel was slowly draining the life from me, one approved policy at a time. It was nearly a year to the day since I made my deal with him, before he called me into his office. Yes, he had an office now, a corner suite with a view of the city. As I entered, I noticed the smell of formaldehyde was stronger than ever.
"Ah, Mr. Johnson," he said, his pale blue eyes gleaming. "I have a special policy for you today, one I think you'll find particularly interesting."
He slid a folder across the desk. With a trembling hand, I opened it. Inside was a life insurance application. My life insurance application. As the meaning of his words sank in, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading all along. Ezekiel had never intended to let me go. He was going to claim me, just as he'd claimed all those other poor souls whose policy I'd approved. But in that moment of terror, something inside me snapped. I'd spent my whole career assessing risks, calculating odds, and suddenly I realized Ezekiel's power over me was built on fear. Fear that I'd given him willingly. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. Ezekiel's smile faltered.
"I beg your pardon."
I stood up, looking him directly in those pale eyes. I said no. This wasn't part of our deal, and I'm done being afraid of you. For a moment, Ezekiel's facade slipped, revealing the decaying horror beneath. But I held my ground. "You have no power over me," I continued, my confidence growing. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on fear and bureaucracy, while I'm cutting you off." I grabbed the file with my application in it and tore it in half. As the pieces fell to the floor, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. Ezekiel let out an inhuman shriek, lunging across the desk at me. But his movements were slow, clumsy, as if he were struggling to maintain his form in our world. I dodged his grasping hands and ran for the door. As I threw it open, I shouted to the stunned office, "Everyone listen, don't approve any more of his policies. He has no power if we don't give it to him." Chaos erupted in the office. Some people screamed, others looked confused, but I saw understanding dawn in a few faces. Those who, like me, had been haunted by nightmares of pale blue eyes and the smell of formaldehyde. As I ran through the building, shouting my warning, I heard Ezekiel's enraged howls behind me. But with each person who listened, each policy that was questioned instead of blindly approved, his voice grew fainter. I burst out of the building, into the sunlight, gasping for breath. For a moment, I thought I saw Ezekiel's withered face in the reflection of a nearby window, those pale blue eyes filled with impotent rage. But then it was gone, fading like a bad dream in the morning light. In the days that followed, there was an investigation. Hundreds of fraudulent policies were uncovered, all traced back to the mysterious Ezekiel Thorne, who seemed to have vanished into thin air. The company underwent a major overhaul, with a new emphasis on ethical practices and thorough vetting. As for me, I slept peacefully for the first time in what felt like years. The nightmares were gone, banished along with the specter of Ezekiel Thorne. I'd learned a valuable lesson about the power of facing your fears and the importance of reading the fine print. Sometimes on dark nights, I think I catch a whiff of formaldehyde or see a flash of pale blue eyes in the shadows. But I'm not afraid anymore. After all, I know the truth now. No ghost, no matter how malevolent or cunning, can stand against the power of human will and a properly denied insurance claim. I was 30 years old when the North Shore area of Massachusetts experienced the most alien windstorm in its history. This was sometime in 2018, and my grandma was 85. It was the whirlwind that made me realize she had a life before mine, that she existed before me, existed before my mother, and I guess was her own person. It was her first time experiencing life, too, just like me. Of course, you know your grandma's a person, too, but the sobering revelation that she wasn't always your grandma is intense in a quiet sort of way. It was the windstorm that made me realize that the little girl in the black and white photo was her. The photograph taken in 1935 had a dusty brown hue clouding over it, and it showed my grandmother in a dress beside a rocking horse. Her cheeks had the leftover insulation of baby fat, and her mouth was open because the English language was still too big to fit in there. She looked confused in the photograph, like all children universally do before a camera. Whenever I had seen that photograph, which was usually in the kitchen, on the table, in my grandmother's house, I couldn't bring myself to believe that that was her. How many times had I flipped the picture over to read Dorothy, 1935 on the back, and how many times had that not solidified that it was her? Dorothy Springfield was born in 1933, during the Great Depression, and there had been times when she talked to me as if she remembered every second of it. But I find that hard to believe as well when I see that photograph of that little girl. Mom would have put the clothes on the line while Dad was at the pond fishing for eels for supper, she told me. I mean, maybe she remembered the final year of the Depression, but I just couldn't believe it. My hands used to get so cold while putting up the laundry, she mused wonderfully. I would stand on the buckets to reach the clothesline. That was my chore. That was how I helped out. She had my baby pictures on the fridge, and I had a better inclination that that was in the past compared to my inclination that the little girl in the photographs was my grandmother. Some stories of hers that I remember included one where she crashed her first car in 1950, and another when she broke her arm in the 40s as a teenager. But she hadn't wanted to tell her parents because she feared they'd be mad at her. She did eventually tell them when she couldn't get the clothes on the line. And then she became, well, old, but adapted to the modern world, spending the evenings multitasking games of poker on her phone and an e-book on her tablet. Yet she had occasional phone troubles that I helped her with, but she, for the most part, knew how to navigate technology. I, after all, can't say I ever put clothes on the line. I liked my grandmother's stories. Were they my grandmother's stories? Or were they Dorothy Springfield stories? I saw her in the flesh, and saw the photographs of her as a toddler, her in that new car that she crashed, her in a wedding dress with my Elvis look-alike of a grandfather, but there always remained this intangible disconnect between Grandma and Dorothy Springfield. To her, I was all one person, grandbaby Ronald Springfield. To me, she was Grandma, not Grandma Dorothy Springfield. I wonder if my grandma found some similarities between the news on the TV that day and the radio broadcast about the dust storm that she might have listened to as a little girl. Whatever it was, it puzzled the meteorologists. Still, they read the weather and circled their hands over the radar map while tracking the windstorm. Oddly enough, there hadn't been any rain, despite the cloudy disposition outside. The day outside was sick with grayness, and the trees along the border of the neighbors' houses were having their branches tested by the wind, waving one way and then waving another, with their leaves possessed with the cadence of a million uncoordinated jazz hands. We watched the news while the windstorm was underway outside. One clip showed an old lady who looked like Susan B. Anthony crossing the street, shuffling along with her walker before flipping up into the air with her whole entire body spinning like a punted football. The old lady was not identified, and unfortunately, she was not the only one. We all knew that their walkers weren't going to help them up where they were going. I remember they showed footage of staff at the local nursing home nailing boards of wood across the windows. They even got up on ladders to board the second-story windows. They said that the nursing home's third-floor occupants were evacuated to the first and second floors in a rush. Airplanes weren't grounded because of the wind, but grounded because of one close call from pilot Captain Milton, where he circled over a suburb outside of Boston before coming into land. On the news, they played the audio of Captain Milton reporting his sighting to air traffic control of an old lady being sucked through some current of wind, just narrowly missing the side of the plane. Many passengers who had their windows open corroborated the report. The news reporter, a young Asian American woman, held our attention while she spoke. First responders and witnesses in the area remained baffled by the unexpected weather, and even more baffled by who the unprecedented wind seems to affect. They cut to a clip of another elderly woman being dragged up into the sky and carried up over the rooftops of a residential neighborhood in Lynn. It cut back to the news lady, who continued speaking. Authorities warn that female members of Massachusetts' elderly population might be at risk of being blown away. If you or a loved one you may know are over the age of 60, Massachusetts law enforcement and first responders are suggesting that you refrain from stepping outside until the wind settles down. With that, I'm Antoinette Untilly, Channel 5 News. I turned the TV off and looked at my grandma. For the first time in 8 decades, the English language was too big to fit in her mouth, so I tried cracking a joke. How old are you, Grandma? 59? The wind landed a heavy punch against the side of the house, as if it knew she was inside. She spoke as if I'd never made the joke at all. Roland, dear, what's it look like outside, in the park? I blinked. I was a little worried, but I got up and looked out the window anyway, to check the park that was across the street. My eyes widened when I saw an old woman in jogging attire, holding onto the fence at the park while her feet hovered in the air. She had on green neon wristbands and a pink neon headband. I couldn't quite see her face because her entire body was at a 90-degree angle while the wind was trying to rip her off the fence, but I knew she had to have been at least 60 because of the 1980s style jogging wear she had on. What do you see, Roland? My grandma squeaked from behind me. The wind was just too much. I watched the elderly jogger get vacuumed into the sky. Nothing, Grandma, I lied. Does anybody need our help? Our help, I said, in a kind of surprised hiss. I turned around and saw my grandma was unfortunately serious. You're a strong young man. She had always believed that, ever since I was a lanky middle schooler. And I'm nimble, and you're many things, Grandma, I said, walking away from the window, but she continued speaking. Can't we go out there and help guide any lost stragglers inside? People shouldn't weather this wind alone. I couldn't hold back the disappointment on my face. Either you help me, or I'm going out there alone. You heard the news, Grandma, I snapped urgently. You can't go out there. I can't go out there alone, she said matter-of-factly. Okay, I said breathily, noticing the determination in my grandma's eyes. We'll go out there, but We're going to do it my way. I'm going to tie a rope or something to my waist and tie the other end to yours. We'll look around, and if we can't find anybody, then we'll come back inside." I could tell that she didn't like the idea of going back inside, but there was a stubborn agreement in her eyes.
"Roland,"
my grandmother squealed while we trudged out onto the front lawn. I twisted my torso in order to hold onto the rope behind me because I could feel the wind trying to take my grandma away. She was holding onto the rope in front of her. There was something so fragile about her. She was not holding onto the rope. She was not holding on to the clothesline from 80 years ago, but she was holding on to an umbilical cord. I had to speak just to snap myself out of whatever trance this realization was about to put me into. "Come on, Grandma," I wanted to shout, but I just couldn't. For all that talk inside the house, she was just so frail. Still, she trudged behind me while the wind threatened to pull the very silver hair out of her scalp while it barely tousled mine. We crossed the street where the smell of peppermint was stale in the air. Somebody's laundry was running loose in the air above, with sleeves of a red sweater flapping in its wake. We walked along the fence the old jogger had been holding on to, and we entered the park through a gate. The playground was abandoned, and its swing sets creaked in the wind. The baseball diamond was also abandoned, and though no kids were playing soccer in the field, the soccer net was still catching volleys of wind. It looked as if 1,000 invisible soccer balls were being hurled into the net. My grandma saw it before I did. "Oh my goodness," she squeaked. It was Belinda, one of the women in my grandmother's book club. She had a little lapdog named Mop that was working its tiny legs across the grass, yapping up into the wind while its leash was dragged along. When I looked over, I saw what he was chasing and barking. His owner, Belinda, 78 years old, was floating away. Mop was chasing after her, even though he had no chance of catching her. She had her arms outstretched, snow angel style. The wind rolled her up, taking her over the playground where Mop followed, and she vanished, up, and away.
"Belinda," my grandmother called.
"Come on, Grandma," I urged. We carried on as the sound of Mop yapping faded out behind us. "Grandma, look out," I shouted as a mobility scooter came crashing out of nowhere. It just narrowly avoided us, but the impact shook the ground enough to make my grandma lose her balance. I went back and helped her up.
"Roland,"
her voice starting like an engine.
"Roland."
At first, I was confused until I saw what was happening with the balls of her feet. They were lifting up and off the grass. She slapped her hand down on my shoulder, alarm in her eyes.
"Roland,"
she squealed. The rest of her started slowly hovering off the ground. Her fingers slipped off my shoulders, and now the only thing keeping her from floating away was the rope that connected us. "Grandma," I started tugging on the rope, tugging and pulling it into my side, but the wind demanded her. I was playing tug-of-war of mythical proportions with a gale, and my grandma was at stake. I watched her hold out her arms in front of her, keeping her arms up and out as much of her joints and bones would allow, while some invisible force seemed to be suctioning on her back and trying to vacuum her away. An old lady tumbled by in the distance over her shoulder. I started digging my feet through the grass, beginning the trek back to my grandma's house while my grandma floated above me like a float in the Macy's Day Parade. Her voice was becoming part of the wind. "Roland!" Closer and closer to the gate. I was getting closer to the gate. "Roland!" Another old lady came barreling through the air and grabbed onto my grandma. "Please," the old lady spoke hoarsely, "you've got to help me." I could feel the addition of the old lady having a negative effect on the rope. For some reason, the wind must have thought 2 old ladies were much better than 1, so now it was pulling even harder. But now I was in the street, and I was getting her closer to my grandma's house. "Roland's my grandson," my grandma told the old lady. "He's gonna take us back to my house. He's a good fella." I was in the driveway, my feet suddenly gaining the speed of snails. I was approaching the front door, but the weight of the 2 old ladies was too much. The rope's many veins began to undo themselves until it snapped. "Grandma!" I called as I watched my grandmother and the other old lady recede into the sky. They separated from each other and circled each other, moving like figure skaters that lost their mind, going in and out of the vortex, circling the drain of the windstorm until they shrank in the distance. The wind was only bothering my hair. It didn't care about me. I gulped and looked at the sick pearl sky for a while, waiting for it to give my grandma back, but it never did. I must have stood outside my grandmother's house for an hour that windy day, just thinking, just waiting. For some reason, that was when my grandma and Dorothy Springfield morphed into one whole person. The wind roared as if it was applauding itself. Something up there was satisfied with its actions. How many other grandmas were now being slipshotted through the current far away where the wind returned to, where the wind stirred the amalgamation of old ladies. How many grandmas, old women, were being lost in the wind and time. I knew one thing for sure. One of them wasn't going to be lost to time. Teddy and I had been working at Disney for years. The 2 of us had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of young cast members come and go, heading off to college or to better jobs and brighter futures. Meanwhile, the 2 of us stuck around and became a running joke to some of the younger employees, since we were never promoted to management, that is. Most of the lower-level members were young, in their early 20s or late teens, and to them, it was just a part-time gig, a way to raise money for college or to pass a bit of time until their real lives and careers began. But Teddy and I were lifers, and some would say losers, although I would never attach that label to myself willingly. I'd heard it whispered enough times to know that it was what other people thought of us. We'd both been there for nearly 2 decades, and had worked on pretty much every single attraction, but had never been deemed responsible enough to be promoted to supervisor status. Over all that time, I found a lot of secrets about the place, some things that are known to the public, but also some revelations that aren't talked about anywhere. Did you know that cast members who work as mascots have to wear communal underwear? Yeah, that's right. They all share the same underoos, and they get washed in between uses. At least, in theory. Who knows what pervert came up with that idea? Or how about the fact the skeleton on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride was originally constructed out of real bones? Despite the park's insistence that all the bones were removed, a few still remain. Management lost track of which were real and which were fake, and they just left the real ones in there along with the imposters. But when you're up close, it's easy to tell them apart. The real ones are a little more yellow, and they're heavier than the plaster ones. There are plenty of morbid secrets like that. People scatter the ashes of their deceased loved ones in the park so frequently, we actually have a not-so-subtle code name for it. A white powder alert. The Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean are the most common places, but it's done all over, and who knows how often people get away with it without even being noticed. Code 101 means a ride is temporarily shut down, while Code V, or a protein spill, means that someone has vomited on a ride and it needs to be cleaned up. Those spills are often the cause of ride shutdowns, rather than mechanical issues. Oh, and if you hear yourself, or someone else being referred to as a treasured guest, it doesn't mean you're a VIP. It's actually our code word for saying you're being an asshole. There are stories of ghosts, some told by people who never believed in such things before witnessing them in the park. The specter of Walt Disney himself has been seen a couple of times, outside Sleeping Beauty's castle just on the other side of the drawbridge. Or sometimes he's seen at night just outside his old apartment on Main Street, where occasionally you might smell a whiff of cigarette smoke, despite the fact that such things are banned inside the park. Walt and his family once lived there, so they could spy on visitors and listen to their opinion on the park. They would eavesdrop on their conversations from the second-floor apartment, just above the street level. George, a dead electrician, supposedly haunts the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and every morning, cast members must call out, "Good morning, George," at the start of the day. Otherwise, the ride will mysteriously have issues all day long. Unexpected shutdowns and other strange things often occur if George isn't given his proper morning greeting. And have you heard about the animatronics in It's a Small World running all night long? Yep, those rumors are true too. In fact, quite a few of the lifelike robots stay in motion 24/7, even throughout the lockdown and park shutdowns a couple of years back. If you ask the management about it, they'll tell you it's because the attractions are cheaper to maintain that way. They break down less frequently if they're in constant motion. That's the excuse we get anyway. But I've come to realize there might be far more terrifying reasons for this. Something so disturbing and twisted that I wouldn't have thought it was possible if I hadn't witnessed it for myself. Teddy and I were on our lunch break when we found the storage room. We were looking for somewhere a little more private since Teddy had brought a bit of homemade greenery and his favorite piece of glassware that day. The park has miles and miles of tunnels crisscrossing beneath it, and Teddy and I had explored most of the labyrinth over our years of service. Like everything else in the park, there was a stupid nickname for these underground tunnels. They had been dubbed utilidors by some management types in the distant past. Most of the cast members just called them the tunnels, and they were so vast we often used golf carts to get from one end of them to the other. There were odd dead ends at some of the tunnels that seemed to intentionally lead to nowhere. We were currently in one such useless utilidor when we noticed an odd-looking door which appeared to be at least half a century old, if not more. It had a rusted placard hanging over its surface which read, "Obsolete animatronic storage." "Hey, didn't there used to be a vending machine there?" Teddy asked. "Who cares? Let's see if it opens. We've only got 20 minutes left," I said, looking at the time on my cell phone. The doorknob turned in my hand, and the two of us went inside. I looked for a light switch on the wall to my right, but I didn't find one. It was pitch black and impossible to see anything. Using the flashlight on my phone, I cast a beam of light around the room, trying to see what kind of space we were in. There were people-shaped forms all around us, draped in tarps and tablecloths. The room was as long as a football field, but it was narrow, only about 15 feet across. "Creepy," Teddy said, taking the words right out of my mouth. Well, I guess it did say this was animatronic storage. This must be really old. He wandered away from the door, and it clicked shut behind him. Something about that made me nervous, but I had ignored the feeling. The door had been unlocked, and that meant we'd be able to get out again. Still, I reached for the knob to check it. My hand was about to touch the polished brass when Teddy called out, making me jump. "Whoa! Check this out!" he said, sounding excited. I left the door, turning around to see what he was looking at. He had his cell phone light on as well, and was lifting up one of the tarps to look at what was underneath. "Man, this thing's freaky looking." He pulled the tarp away, and I saw what he meant. The thing hidden beneath was very creepy. It had the goateed face of a young man, but the ears and nubby horns of a goat, looking far too real. Its lower half looked like it also belonged to a goat. The thing reminded me of a satyr, those drunken, lustful half-goat gods from Greek mythology. I tried to figure out why it was making me feel so uneasy, and realized it was the eyes. They were too lifelike, far more real than the animatronics out in the park, and the look of the skin, the way it reflected the light and anything about it, it looked like it was a real creature. More likely, a man had been sewn to the body of a goat in a very thorough way, making the seams blend together perfectly. Teddy was already moving on to the next one, looking under another tarp. He left me alone with this one, and I looked back down at it as I let go of the cover and let it fall across its face again. Flinching backwards, I nearly screamed, as I could have sworn the eyes of the thing were looking at me, just as I dropped the tarp over its face. My heart was beating fast, and I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or that the eyes had been looking up that way the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. "We need to go," I heard myself say, but Teddy wasn't listening. "Holy crap, this one's even more jacked up. Dude, you gotta check this out." I opened my mouth to say, "No, let's get out of here," but my words caught in my throat. The satyr creature under the tarp was clearly moving now. Its head was still draped in the plastic sheet, but I could see it turning to look at me, as if its gaze could penetrate through the tarp. "Dude, come check this out," Teddy was yelling, pulling the next sheet off and dropping it to the floor. I saw what he was referring to, my eyes drawn to it despite the terror of the draped creature just in front of me. This one was tall, standing nearly 10 feet. It had one large eye instead of two. Man, whoever made these things was tripping on acid or something. Look at this thing. It looks like they jacked an eye from an elephant and stuffed it in some dude's forehead. I think they were trying to make a cyclops. I could barely hear him, as now the thing in front of me wasn't the only figure in the room which was moving. To my left, the entire row of covered forms were beginning to stretch and turn as they woke up from whatever sleep they had been in. Some were tall, some were short, like the satyr thing on my right, but all of them were alive. I realized it was very cold all of a sudden, and realized I could see my breath steaming out in the air. A compressor groaned to life, and I saw a nearby vent cough out a frosty plume as if something had been jammed or broken and was suddenly operating again. The temperature in the room began to plummet, and a second later, I was freezing cold, the rushing air chilling the back of my neck. Finally, I was shocked out of my stupor and managed to get a word out. "Teddy," I croaked, but too late. The giant cyclops hand shot out and grabbed my friend by the throat. It lifted him up into the air while his legs kicked and his arms thrashed, trying to break its grip. He was choking and sputtering, flailing madly as he tried to free himself. The cyclops firmly held him by the throat, and I heard the sound of cartilage and bones being crushed. His spine popped, and his head bent back at an impossible angle, his skull lolling backwards like a broken Pez dispenser. And then the giant dropped him to the concrete floor of the room, and his phone clattered and turned over, casting half the room in darkness again. I backed away, feeling like I was moving in slow motion, but unable to go any quicker. Reaching back for the doorknob, it felt like the tunnel had grown by 100 feet. It was further away than it could possibly have ever been. I kept backing up, taking slow, quiet steps. The figures were moving towards me, all of them closing the gap and slowly walking in my direction. Their forms were covered, draped in bed sheets and tarps and tablecloths, as if this place had been thrown together in a hurry, hastily constructed to house these possessed animatronics or whatever these creatures were. Cold air was filling the room, making it even more difficult to move. My skin felt like it was being stabbed with pins and needles, the freezing wind going right through my summer clothes. There was a sound of tearing flesh and blood being spilled. I looked to see several of the monsters were tearing the skin from Teddy's face, peeling it from his bones with some difficulty, like trying to open an underripe orange. The worst part was, it looked like he was still alive. He was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, his eyes wide open as if he'd be screaming if he were capable of it. I tried to tear my eyes away from it, but I couldn't. I found myself staring at him as they took the flesh off his face. I backed up hard into something and realized it was the door. In the darkness, I felt for the doorknob behind me, but I couldn't find it. The creatures were still moving towards me, all of their faces covered by sheets except for the massive cyclops that had killed my friend. Its one huge eye was fixed on me, and as it moved in lockstep with the other creatures, they all seemed to share one hive mind. As they approached, a few stepped on each other's coverings, tearing them away and revealing their hideous faces. I saw a woman's upper body sewn onto the legs of a deer, and a man with the hindquarters of a bull, their faces full of mute anger. My hand groped for the doorknob desperately, and after several long moments, it settled on the smooth brass. It was so cold, almost frozen. I spun around, expecting the doorknob to turn easily, but this time it was stuck. I couldn't tell if it was locked or frozen solid, but either way it wouldn't budge. Feeling like there would be icy hands around my throat at any second, I was too terrified to turn around. I heard the sound of shuffling feet moving closer, the icy wind blowing through my clothes and raising goosebumps on my skin. I began pounding against the door with my fists, banging on it as hard as I could as I screamed for help, pleading for someone to save me. "Help! Help! Open the door!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. The corridor we had entered was a dead end, rarely used by anyone. Of course, this door would be locked from the inside, I thought to myself. Who would offer an escape to these animatronic demons? If they had ever been imbued with any form of failsafe, it was long ago out of commission and useless. These creatures had no mercy and no respect for human life. They wanted blood and flesh and meat to create more of themselves, to raise an army of undead robotic soldiers. Manic thoughts were racing through my head as I tried to think of another way out. There had to be something, some other way out. I turned around, hoping for some other exit to present itself, but instead I just saw hundreds of shrouded forms stepping closer and closer until they were just a few feet away. A gurgling, wheezing sound could be heard from behind them, and I realized it was the labored breathing of Teddy slowly dying. If I didn't get out of here, I'd be next. With one desperate move, I kicked out towards the head of the nearest shrouded figure. It was the satyr. My foot connected with his face, and as it did, the entire crowd fell back a step, as if hurting one of them would hurt all of them. I lashed out with another blow, punching it in the gut, and the crowd took another wounded step backward. I used the newfound space to my advantage and took a short running start towards the door. Kicking it hard with my boot, I connected squarely with the spot behind the doorknob. It rattled in the frame, but it didn't budge. Taking a quick look back over my shoulder, I saw the crowd of animatronic creatures were coming at me again with renewed anger. They looked furious at me for assaulting one of them, and apparently I had injured it. The satyr was slumped forward, its joints making creaky noises as it made its way towards me, its movements jerky and disorganized. I kicked the door again, harder this time, using every ounce of force I could muster. I heard something splinter and break, but it still wouldn't budge. Icy hands grabbed my throat from behind, and I threw an elbow backward to try to break free. It connected with whatever had grabbed me, and it didn't let go. Instead, its grip tightened, choking and squeezing my throat until I couldn't breathe. I let out another strangled cry for help, but no sound came out this time. The grip on my windpipe was making it impossible to call out. My feet were going numb from the cold, which seemed to have intensified even more somehow. I hadn't thought it was possible to feel any colder, but I realized that whoever was controlling the temperature of this place was doing this on purpose. These things didn't like the cold, and it put them in a state of hibernation. For some reason, this place had been almost room temperature when we entered, bringing these creatures back to life. With one more desperate effort, I lifted my leg and kicked as hard as I could, my heel connecting with the door just beside the latch. Something shattered and broke loudly, and the door swung open on its hinges. The momentum brought me forward, and I found myself tumbling back into the corridor. Whatever had grabbed hold of me came with me, the icy hand still around my neck. As I landed, the thing's fingers broke off like icicles, shattering on impact. The shrouded creature was writhing on the floor, looking as if it wanted to get up and chase me, but wasn't quite capable of it yet. It was still too cold. I stumbled to my feet and ran from there, not really thinking about my mistake until I was far past that point. When it occurred to me what I had done, it was too late. I had let those things out. I'd opened the door and freed them, and I had allowed the warm air inside so they could come back to life and escape. I was too terrified to stay in the park. I went home immediately without saying a word to anyone, then called my boss and told him I was sick with a stomach flu. I apologized, saying I'd been throwing up in the bathroom and didn't want to cause a code V while on stage. He told me that was okay, since he knew I was a dedicated employee, trusted cast member who had been with the park for years. But he did ask if I'd seen Teddy, and I had to lie and tell him I hadn't. I'm supposed to go back to work tomorrow, for the first time since all of this happened. The worst part about it, nobody has reported Teddy missing. His family hadn't called to say anything either. It's almost like none of it ever happened, except I've got the marks around my neck, the bruises that prove I didn't imagine it. I just got a strange message from Teddy on his cell phone. He says, "See you at work tomorrow, buddy," accompanied by a mouse emoji. Me and some of the cast members have a big surprise for you. "We used to have to take the corpses out with a crane," he told me once, "because they were so intertwined. Entire pyramids of bodies, people climbing on top of one another, clawing each other to get away from the gas. They used to tell us it was a quick death, but everyone knew it wasn't. The screaming in the chamber would go on for 15 or 20 minutes. They used to put a little glass window in the door so the doctor could look in and watch." My grandfather, Alexander, had told me about his time in the Sonderkommando, the corpse units of the National Socialist concentration camps. He had been arrested in Poland simply because he'd been a leader in his field and an intellectual with a history of supporting Polish nationalism. This had raised red flags, and during a roundup of the intelligentsia, my grandfather had also been arrested and tortured by the Gestapo. They had made him sign something that he never got to read. Then he had been moved to prison and, eventually, to his new job. The day it happened, my friend Bartok and I were on duty. Our job was to lead the people towards the chambers without alerting them or causing a riot. The Sonderkommandos used lines like, "Don't forget where you put your clothes because you'll need to come back to them," or "Tie your shoes together for convenience to make it easier to find them when you come back." We always emphasized how they would come back after the shower, but I never looked them in the eye when I said it. He stared out the window for a long moment after this, his mug of coffee steaming in front of him. I knew not to interrupt him. He often talked to me about his experiences. It seemed like he wanted to draw poison out of his memories, and letting him talk seemed to help him do it. So the chamber was packed, as always. 800 people smashed into a tiny area, like sardines. To get the last one in, the SS would often beat and bludgeon people. The claustrophobia must have been horrifying. The lack of air, the packed chamber, like a massive coffin. By the time they slammed the door closed, there wasn't an extra inch of space into the entire chamber. In fact, after they opened the door, their bodies would often still be standing, because there was simply no room for them to fall down. Except for the middle of the chamber, of course. There, people lived the longest. They tried to escape from the gas. We would see infants and small children at the bottom of human pyramids, smothered and stampeded. The stronger ones would be at the top, having climbed over the bodies of others to try and get some air at the top of the chamber. The gas did have a tendency to fall, depending on the temperature and the humidity. When they opened the doors, Bartok and I walked in among the others of the Sonderkommando. We used long canes to pull the bodies out. At first, a Sonderkommando would treat the bodies with respect, but after tens of thousands of bodies, you just started throwing them like bags of potatoes. It was our job, after all. He said it with an ironic misery, his eyes getting misty. Bartok and I would then pile the bodies on carts as we brought them to the other teams of Sonderkommandos. One team, which we called the dentists, would rip out the gold teeth so they could melt them down into bars and send them back to Germany. Another would shave all the remaining hair off the corpses. They'd shaved them when they first got there, but any remainder would make the crematorium reek of burning hair. Bartok and I were moving our carts of corpses up the lift elevator when a commotion suddenly broke out in a nearby medical barracks. They called it a medical barracks, but in reality it was mostly a place where doctors experimented on people, where the sick were often given lethal doses of this chemical or that. This also wasn't a quick death, as the person would begin to get agonizing cramps and a burning sensation before devolving into unconsciousness. I had no idea what was going on. At first I thought the SS were trying to prevent a prisoner escape, or maybe someone had already escaped and they were in an uproar. It looked like someone had kicked a hornet's nest. I saw government vehicles speeding in with fully armed troops. The guards surrounded the gates of the camp, a thick ring of black-suited soldiers. I saw a doctor running out of the barracks, blood covering his white lab coat. His eyes looked wild, and he screamed something in German to the soldiers. He kept screaming it over and over again. "Die, Wolfen! Die, Wolfen!" he said. Most of the Sonderkommandos, including myself, knew at least a little German. It was, after all, the administrative language of the National Socialist State, and the Germans never deigned to speak to us in our language, unless they were torturing us or trying to get information. By this time, Bartok and I had paused, a cart full of emaciated, naked corpses lying in front of us. The doctor ran past us, not noticing, his eyes wild. He continued to scream gibberish in German, speaking so fast I could barely understand anything except for two words: the girl and the wolf. "What the hell do you think that's about?" Bartok asked me, his blue eyes wide and uncertain. I just shook my head, feeling numb. I hadn't felt much of anything in months, to be honest. I had closed myself down emotionally, psychologically removing myself from the present. I saw much of this as if it were happening to someone else. In my mind, I think I was trying to protect myself. Even now, looking back, I feel like I'm telling someone else's story sometimes. A torrent of gunfire erupted from the medical barracks, and then a woman ran out. It was a nurse, and her face looked like a mask of gore. One eye hung limply from its socket, and her entire left cheek was hung down in ribbons, a flap of skin revealing the teeth behind, like some sort of grotesque half-smile. In her remaining eye, I saw mortal terror and fear. Seeing it coming from our captors loosened something inside me. Bartok felt the same way. We left our carts of dead and turned to run. At that moment, something tore its way out of the barracks. As I saw what it was, I began running with all the energy that my starving body could provide. It was a girl. At least, it had been. She looked no older than 12 or 13, and she wore a striped uniform, soaked in blood. Her arms and legs lengthened before my eyes, forming long claws that erupted from her fingers. Her mouth had formed into a strange rictus grin, with drops of blood falling from her sharpening teeth. Stringy black hair seemed to be growing from her head, and her eyes, they were turning yellow, with slitted demonic pupils gleaming in the center, emanating a bloodlust and fury that I'd never seen before. The SS guards and soldiers had streamed in from the front gate by this point, running at her and shouting orders. Automatic rifles began to fire, and Bartok grabbed my hand and pulled me down to the ground just in time. I heard bullets whizzing over my head, smashing into the crematorium chimney and the surrounding barracks. I knew they weren't shooting at me, but so many soldiers had opened fire that the entire area had turned into a shooting gallery. I looked back and saw bullets ripping into the girl's body. Gore blossomed from her chest, blood and flesh exploding out of exit wounds, covering the bare dirt around her. With a roar, she jumped on top of the barracks, leaping 20 feet into the air. To my amazement, I watched the wounds healing before my eyes. I wondered what kind of strange medical experiment this was that could produce such an effect. Bartok shook me, saying we had to run, we had to get out, but I just stood there, shell-shocked. He slapped me, pulling me up and towards the gas chamber. "We can barricade ourselves inside the chamber," he said. I gasped. "I'm not going to lock myself in there," I shouted, waves of anxiety rising in my chest. I had images of the door slamming closed and Zyklon B being poured through the vents. I shuddered, but we kept running towards it, not knowing where else to go. As we got inside the crematoria, the windows smashed inward, and I saw the girl had followed us. She'd completely transformed by this point. Her skin looked yellow and papery against the long, wolfish frame. Tatters of the blood-stained uniform still clung to her body. I saw no marks from where the bullets had struck her. She ran towards us, lashing out with clawed hands. Bartok pushed me just in time, and I fell, the claw missing my face by a fraction of an inch. I began to crawl away, looking back at Bartok as he began to cry out in terror. I looked and saw him backing away from her, his hands raised, pleading. "I don't want to die. I don't want to die," he kept saying. In a blur, she leapt forward, ripping at his throat, the bloody rictus grin still plastered across her face. A torrent of blood rushed out from the gaping wound, soaking the front of his body. She opened her mouth wide and drank the spouting arterial stream, sucking at it as she held up his body with her clawed hands. When she was done, she threw it aside and looked down at me. I had begun to rise, to jump up and run when she tackled me from behind. I felt a searing pain in my back as her claws connected, leaving deep gouges. I felt something sticky and warm flowing down my back, soaking into the rips in my uniform. At that point, a dozen SS men ran in through the front door and began shooting. I was on the floor after she had clawed me, which turned out to be lucky, as the bullets went right over me. Hissing and spitting blood, I turned my head at the last moment to see the girl galloping away from me on all fours, her freakish long arms giving her a lopsided stride. She jumped back through the shattered window she'd come in. The SS men all ran out after her, and I found myself alone with Bartuk's body. I got up and found the rest of the prisoners confined to their barracks with armed guards watching each of the groups. The guards had left the front of the camp in a hurry, and I saw that the gates stood wide open. With blood pouring down my back, I began to creep through the shadows of the camp, checking the watchtowers and the front gates for people. They had all joined in the pursuit or were with the confined prisoners in their barracks, and they had apparently forgotten about a lone Sonderkommando like myself. I finally made my way outside. I didn't see a single other prisoner or guard in the front, but when I looked back, before I left for the final time, I saw the girl leaping over the razor wire fence as countless soldiers pursued her. Good for you, I said to myself. Good for you.